Nobody expected Jasmine Crockett to respond like that, not even DeSantis himself. Everything changed in a single sentence. That's the only way to describe what happened when Ron DeSantis walked into that packed committee room, smirking, confident, and moving with the kind of swagger that suggested he already believed he owned the moment. From the second he entered, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations that had been buzzing only seconds earlier faded into a hush. Staffers straightened up. Even the low hum of cameras seemed to pause, waiting for what would come next. The walls of the room felt tighter, the air heavier. Reporters leaned forward, gripping their pens and phones, preparing to catch every word as if history were about to unfold right in front of them. Camera operators instinctively tightened their shots, zooming in on DeSantis' expression, sharp, calculating, and then shifting to Jasmine Crockett, who sat at the witness table with a calmness that felt almost unreal. Crockett didn't seem intimidated in the slightest. She was poised, composed, flipping through her notes with the relaxed confidence of someone who knew she didn't need theatrics to win a moment. Her posture alone sent a message. She was ready. But Ron DeSantis hadn't come for a standard policy discussion. He hadn't prepared a detailed critique or a data-backed argument or even a serious line of questioning. No, he had come with something much simpler, much riskier, and far more intentional. A curveball. And the dangerous thing about curveballs is that they only work if the other person isn't expecting them. For weeks, DeSantis had been circling Crockett in the media, taking small jabs, implying she lacked seriousness, painting her as someone who reacted too emotionally. It wasn't new, but the energy behind his comments had been building, signaling that he wanted a big, viral moment to solidify the narrative he was trying to create. Today, in this room, in front of these cameras, he planned to deliver it. The panel members sensed it too. Some exchanged glances, others leaned back as though preparing for impact. Even the aides sitting behind DeSantis seemed a little too alert, as if they knew he wasn't going to play by the traditional rules of decorum. Crockett closed her folder and placed her pen down. She didn't speak, she didn't look up, but something about the stillness in her posture said she already knew what was coming, and she wasn't impressed. Then, in the space of a few seconds, the energy shifted again, sharpening like a blade being drawn. DeSantis leaned in, lowered his voice just enough to sound calm, but loud enough to dominate the room. And then he threw his curveball. A single sentence, delivered with a smirk. A sentence meant to belittle, provoke, and embarrass. And the moment those words left his mouth, the entire atmosphere detonated. The room shifted from quiet anticipation to shock, pure electric shock. Reporters froze mid-note. Cameras snapped into overdrive. Even the panel members reacted, eyes widening, mouths tightening, backs straightening. Everyone knew instantly. This wasn't politics anymore. This was a line crossed. And whatever Jasmine Crockett did next would define the moment. Ron DeSantis wasn't there to play nice. Anyone who had followed him over the past several weeks knew exactly what he was building toward. In interview after interview, on morning shows, primetime panels, and even podcast appearances, he kept dropping the same pointed hints. He painted Jasmine Crockett as someone out of her depth, someone too emotional, someone who doesn't understand the game. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't clever. It was deliberate. And now, standing just a few feet away from her, he finally had the moment he'd been sharpening those talking points for. This wasn't a policy hearing to him. It was a stage, and he wanted the viral clip. Crockett, meanwhile, sat with her hands folded, posture straight, eyes calm, almost bored. She had watched men like DeSantis try this tactic her entire career. They mistake volume for strength. They mistake smugness for power. They mistake her silence for weakness. But Crockett's silence is never empty. It is strategic, measured, controlled. DeSantis, however, read it as an opening. He leaned forward toward the microphone, letting his shoulders drop and his voice adopt that slow, deliberate cadence he used whenever he wanted to sound superior. The tone dripped with smug confidence, the kind meant to belittle without ever raising the volume. "Representative Crockett," he said, pausing just long enough to make sure every camera was pointed at him. "Maybe you should focus less on grandstanding and more on understanding basic governance. I can explain it slowly for you if needed." The words hit the air like a slap. The room gasped before anyone could stop themselves. It wasn't a political jab. It wasn't even a sharp critique. It was condescension dressed as policy debate, something everyone recognized immediately. Even the stenographer, who had stayed stone-faced through hours of testimony, looked up, eyebrows lifted in disbelief. A few staffers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Someone in the back whispered, "No way he just said that." But through it all, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Not a blink, not a twitch, not a single break in composure. She sat perfectly still, her face transformed into an icy mask, unmoved, razor-focused. It wasn't blankness, it was precision. A quiet, sharpened stillness that said more than any raised voice ever could. And that stillness was louder than the gasp that had just rippled through the chamber. DeSantis misread it entirely. He smirked again, clearly convinced he had landed his big blow. To him, her silence meant she was rattled, that he had caught her off guard, that the clip he wanted, the clip of Jasmine Crockett stunned into speechlessness, was already recording itself. But behind the press section, commentators knew better. They leaned to each other, whispering with the excitement of people who knew a storm was about to break. He really said that. Crockett is not going to let that slide. This is about to get messy. Even the cameraman leaned forward, shifting angles, preparing for the moment they knew was coming. Because Jasmine Crockett never reacts out of impulse. She doesn't rush. She doesn't flail. She chooses her moment. And right now, she chose silence. Long, slow, deliberate silence. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't fear. It was preparation. And that calm silence, the kind that seems to pull all the air out of a room, made the moment even more electric. Everyone could feel it. DeSantis had thrown his punch. Now they were waiting for Crockett to throw hers. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice didn't rise, it didn't shake, it didn't carry even a hint of anger. Instead, it was low, even, and so perfectly controlled that it felt like a slow-moving blade slicing straight through the tension in the room. Every syllable was deliberate, every word was sharpened, every pause was intentional. "Governor DeSantis," she began, keeping her gaze locked on him, "I appreciate your offer to explain things slowly. Unfortunately for you, understanding basic governance requires honesty, accountability, and factual grounding. So if you're willing to learn, I can explain those slowly to you." It was like the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. No one spoke, no one moved, no one dared to breathe too loudly. The room erupted, not in noise, but in stunned silence, the kind that rolls through a crowd when they realize they've just witnessed the first strike of something unforgettable. Heads turned in unison toward DeSantis, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if trying to gauge whether he would fire back or crumble under the force of her words. And Crockett, she wasn't finished. Without breaking eye contact, she leaned forward, subtly mirroring his earlier posture. But where his leaned-in stance had been cocky and theatrical, hers was calm, exact, and devastatingly precise. And while we're discussing basic governance, she continued, perhaps you can explain why your administration spent years restricting the very rights you claim to defend. I'll wait. That was the moment. Boom. A simple word, but it captured the exact effect. It hit like an explosion. Every camera light blinked on at once, as if the equipment itself understood this was the moment that would be replayed 1,000 times before sunset. Lenses refocused, boom mics dropped in closer. Journalists who had been half asleep suddenly bolted to attention. Even DeSantis' own staff, trained to keep poker faces, shifted nervously. One glanced at the floor. Another rubbed his forehead. A third looked toward the exit as if questioning his career choices. They could all feel the momentum turning, slipping right out of DeSantis' hands. But Crockett wasn't done making history. She delivered one more blow, the kind of line that internet editors dream of, the kind that becomes a caption, a meme, a headline, a legacy. Next time you plan to throw a curveball, make sure it's based on facts. Otherwise, it's just a bad pitch from someone who's afraid of real debate. That wasn't a rebuttal. That was a dissection. A couple of panel members, struggling to hide their reactions, failed spectacularly. One raised his eyebrows so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. Another pressed her lips tightly together, shoulders shaking with the effort not to laugh or applaud. For a split second, the silence clung to the air, thick and heavy. Then, like a dam breaking, the room came alive. Reporters began typing furiously, fingers flying over keyboards. Cameras zoomed in tighter. Whispers spread like wildfire across the room. Did she really said that? Oh my God, that clip's going to break the internet. And everyone knew it. Lightning had struck, and Jasmine Crockett had delivered the bolt. DeSantis, visibly rattled, tried to fire back. It was subtle at first, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the desk a little too hard, the faint shift in his posture as though he needed to physically steady himself. He straightened up, cleared his throat, and forced his expression back into something resembling confidence. But the cracks were obvious. The ease he had walked in with just minutes earlier was gone. Representative Crockett, he began, trying to reclaim authority with volume, but the sentence fell apart before it could even take shape. The tone wasn't sharp, it wasn't commanding, it wasn't even persuasive. It sounded weak, thin around the edges, stripped of the certainty he normally relied on. Every word he attempted after that only made it worse. His sentences landed flat, like he was reading lines from a script he hadn't rehearsed. The once steady rhythm of his voice wavered, slipping into a defensive edge he couldn't quite control. Crockett had taken the wind out of his sails so cleanly, so effortlessly, that nothing he said afterward carried any weight at all. Her response had hit him in a place he couldn't hide, his composure. He tried pivoting to talking points, stumbling through pre-packaged lines about leadership and policy. He tried interrupting, hoping to throw off her momentum. He even tried changing the subject entirely, a desperate attempt to steer the moment toward safer ground. But nothing worked. Because everyone in the room, every journalist, every viewer watching the live stream, every staffer lined against the back wall, had already chosen the moment that would go down in the headlines, the TikToks, the reaction videos, the late-night monologues. It wasn't his curveball. It wasn't his insult. It was her answer. That single, calm, precision-cut response she delivered without raising her voice had already drowned out everything he was scrambling to say now. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She didn't even press him with follow-up questions. She simply sat there, composed and unshaken, letting his floundering speak for itself. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't even look amused. She looked resolute, focused, utterly unshakable. And that shook DeSantis far more than if she had yelled back or sparred with him emotionally. He was ready for a fight, something messy, something loud, something he could spin as a clash of personalities. But Crockett gave him none of that. She gave him calm. Cold, confident calm. The kind that exposes weakness without ever needing to point at it. By the time he finished stumbling through his talking points, the transformation was undeniable. The man who had walked in projecting dominance now looked smaller. His shoulders tighter, his gestures forced, his voice losing its edge. He looked less controlled, more exposed, and painfully aware of it. He had come to embarrass her. He had planned it. He had practiced for it. But instead, he embarrassed himself. And the cameras caught every second. Outside the chamber, chaos broke loose the moment the doors swung open. Reporters sprinted forward like they were chasing the story of the year. Cameras lifted, microphones stretched, dozens of voices layered into one sharp wave of noise. But in the middle of all that frantic energy, Jasmine Crockett walked out exactly the way she had walked in, and exactly the way she had delivered her icy reply minutes earlier. Calm, steady, untouched. She didn't rush, she didn't flinch. She didn't even look over her shoulder to see who was calling her name. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what had just happened in that chamber, and what it meant. A reporter finally pushed close enough to get a question out. "Representative Crockett, did you plan that response?" Crockett stopped, just for a moment. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't crack a smile. She didn't show the slightest bit of triumph, even though the internet was already exploding. Instead, she shook her head and said, "No, I just refuse to let disrespect be treated as a strategy." And that line, those 10 words, blew open a new wave of headlines. Behind her, the tension shifted, because only moments later, Ron DeSantis stepped out of the chamber, and the difference between the two couldn't have been more dramatic. While Crockett walked out like she had just navigated a storm without getting touched by rain, DeSantis appeared like a man trying to escape a battlefield he accidentally started. He scanned the hallway. Cameras were everywhere. Reporters were already moving toward him. The questions were already being loaded like ammunition. "Governor, do you regret the comment?" "Governor, was that curveball intentional?" "Governor, do you think Crockett's response made you look?" But DeSantis didn't let any of those questions hit him. He tightened his smile, just a small, forced, uncomfortable stretch of the lips, and rushed forward with quick steps, practically cutting through the hallway in a desperate sprint to reach the exit. He avoided the questions like they were lasers, like he knew a single wrong move could ignite a second firestorm. But the problem was this: the internet didn't wait for him to answer. Even before he reached the elevators, the clip of his attempted curveball and Crockett's icy reply was everywhere. Thousands of reposts, millions of views, comments flooding every corner of social media before DeSantis even made it to the parking lot. The captions were ruthless. "Crockett freezes DeSantis." "The curveball that backfired." "Icy response straight up ends him." She didn't just answer, she demolished him. On political shows, commentators replayed the moment frame by frame, analyzing Crockett's tone, DeSantis' reaction, and the exact instant the room shifted from loud to silent. One analyst put it perfectly. It wasn't just her words, it was the power behind them. DeSantis threw a curveball, but Crockett caught it bare-handed and threw it right back. Another commentator added, "This wasn't a debate moment. This was a turning point." Before long, the moment wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. On YouTube, reaction channels stitched the clip into breakdown videos. On TikTok, people reenacted the exchange with dramatic music. On Instagram, every political page was posting the freeze frame of Crockett leaning forward, delivering her reply with absolute precision. Some called it the sharpest takedown of the year. Others said it was the moment Crockett proved she wasn't just another voice in the chamber. She was one of the few capable of shifting the tone of the entire room with a single sentence. Inside political circles, staffers whispered that it was the most decisive exchange DeSantis had walked into in months, and one he walked out of looking rattled. Behind closed doors, some said the governor's team immediately began discussing damage control, trying to figure out how to reshape the narrative. Others believed there was no recovering from the optic of him dodging reporters. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't appear shaken, defensive, or even celebratory. She went on with her day. No long speeches, no victory lap, no gloating on social media. She simply acted like someone who understood her job and refused to let disrespect become normal. And that contrast, her calm versus his scramble, became the story. Days later, opinion pieces started dropping. Why Crockett's icy response was more than a clapback. The curveball miscalculation, what DeSantis didn't expect. A lesson in composure under fire. One columnist summed it up like this: "Some people speak loudly. Crockett speaks clearly, and that is far more dangerous." Soon, the clip wasn't just trending globally. It was being replayed on morning shows, late-night commentary programs, and podcasts across the country. People debated it, people analyzed it, people admired it. Because there was something undeniably cinematic about what happened in that chamber. A calculated curveball, a split-second silence, a perfectly delivered response that froze the room, and a political figure walking out faster than he walked in. The public had made up their mind long before DeSantis or his team crafted a statement. And one thing became crystal clear. If Ron DeSantis ever thought about throwing another curveball at Jasmine Crockett, he would think twice, maybe 3 times. Maybe he wouldn't throw it at all. Because after this moment, everyone understood the same thing. Jasmine Crockett doesn't just respond, she dismantles. And she does it with the kind of calm that makes the room go silent. And if moments like this keep unfolding, trust me, you're not going to want to miss what comes next. So if you felt that energy, if you witnessed that shift in the room, hit that like button right now. Subscribe for more unbelievable political showdowns and turn on the notifications so you never miss a story that shakes the room just like this one. Thanks for watching and stay tuned because the next chapter is coming.